All right. Oh, geez. Now I need to turn that down without turning everything down. Oh, geez. That's true. Oh. Is that distracting? No? Is that okay? Okay. All righty. Let's get started, shall we? Yeah, beautiful day. We got geese out there. The leaves are just so splendid this year, aren't they? It's just what a great place to be. It lights me up just walking in here in the class. And of course, good to be with you in class here and with those folks that are online listening in as well. The proposal is due today. For those that are online, please, I'll send an email around to the crew, and you respond to that email with the proposal. I do prefer hard copies, though, for those who are in class, because now I know I have them, put them in my satchel, and the organization of files is not such an issue then. This is a low-stakes assignment. I'll try to be thorough with the comments so that you've got someplace to go from here. But what I'd recommend at this point, there's that moment of liberation when you actually hand an assignment in. It can be kind of daunting because that's exactly when you find that there's a typo 1, page 2, or something like this, but don't worry about it. Just send it off into the abyss at this point. And I think it's healthy, too, in terms of the writing process, to take a little break, to get yourself started on the project, let that sit for a week. Again, I'll have comments for you and then get restarted again following the break when you get it back. Come at it with fresh eyes. This can be helpful, too. But between now and then, what I would recommend is that you start thinking about the other significant portion of this course, which is the seminar presentation. I think everyone now is signed up. Is that the case? Okay, so on the break, let's make sure we get your name down here. George Grant is still open. The latter part of Time is History may of interest to you.
No, that definitely sounds right, because as we talked about before, I'm already reading that partially.
Let's do it. Okay, so I'll put you down at the break. Make sure you get your name down on the sheet. That's for November 18th. So just to let people know, I'll post this at the library, but November 4th will be the first seminar presentations. That's Tanya and Maria. Then Habermas, November 11th. Avery and Jared. November 18th, we have Gavin, not here today, and Andrew. November 25th, moving into the more contemporary sources, Landon and Patrick. Yeah. Pardon me?
I said I'm good, but I'm just kidding.
Okay. Well, at a point you try to convince yourself. That sort of language. Yeah, I'm good. Mantra, and you'll get there. Yeah. And then Adam on December 2nd. Yeah. So there we have it. That's the rescheduled one. Yeah, pushed, the class that would have been last week. Wow. Yeah.
We're dealing with Kant today? What are we dealing with?
We're on Hegel.
We're on Hegel.
Just following the readings as they went. So we're through Kant. We had our 2 lectures on Kant. We do Hegel, then we do Nietzsche. It makes sense to have them in that sequence because Nietzsche is in so many ways responding to Hegel and Kant. Yeah.
And we're still following so are we following the course schedule, reading schedule as it is on the paper?
Yeah,
It took into account. I think it took into account.
It did take into account?
Yeah, the day before. We learned about that holiday the day before. I think it was on a Tuesday or a Wednesday or something like that, and we had our first class on the Thursday, obviously. So yeah, I pushed the dates. So the dates on the syllabus, I hope, are accurate and reflective of what we're doing in the classroom. Pardon me?
I think it's Hegel for 2 weeks now.
Yeah. So today we've got the first 2 chapters from Hegel's Reason and History, and then the next 2 the week after the break. Okay. In terms of the book, I have been into the bookstore, all kinds of reasons why there aren't books on shelves, everything from shortages of glue and paper to shipping containers. I don't know. I can't really tell you anything about that, but and also an indication that they're moving towards entirely electronic texts as well, which I'm not overly fond of, especially for something like this where you want to have the book in hand and you may want to come back to it again and again because these are perennial texts. Pardon me?
I can tell by like the staining of the
let's see. Oh, so this is a used copy that you got at the bookstore?
Store, yeah.
Let's see.
It's like really.
And it feels like it's from like the 1920s.
Yeah.
That's great. I love it. I love it. What
It
is the
was
public?
really nice to like go through it.
There's something nostalgic about
Yeah,
old books.
yeah.
So yeah, 1953.
Oh.
Actually, it's in pretty good shape for 1953.
Yeah. and I'm
Not
surprised
too
they
much.
had it. Like,
Not too much highlighting there. You're lucky. There you go. And that's helpful because then we can literally be on the same page between the editions, eh? Yeah, mine at this point is like, mine is just falling apart. Pages coming out of it all over the place. So this is the newer version. Same thing though. I've got that older version as well. You know what I should do maybe is I do have a second one, that older edition. I'll put it on reserve at the library if that's helpful to anyone, to be able to get out a hard copy of it there. Okay. Note to self: I just love going to the library anyway. So yeah, be thinking about your seminars at this point. And just to recap quickly the expectation for the seminar, I'm looking for 20 minutes or so of you presenting the key ideas from the text. And what tends to happen is people get maybe a little worried. Has anyone done a seminar here before? A few have, a few haven't. So it's, there's that sort of daunting moment where you say, oh, geez, I'm on now, I have to lead the class in discussion. I get that. But what I tend to see is, you're concerned about what's coming up, and so you put a lot of work into it in terms of your preparations. And people tend to be over-prepared, have more material than they need. And I've seen some of these seminars, an hour and a half, I'm like, yep, that's enough, yeah? So keep your own presentation, the kind of lecture-y part of it, down to 20 minutes or so. The real challenge, what I would encourage you to think about, and maybe talk with your peers and colleagues about, is the discussion portion. A sign, in my view, of a really successful seminar, and that's why I've enjoyed our time here together. There has been active back and forth discussion. That's more engaging, that's more to the point. We're trying to make the ideas our own and interpret them in company with one another. Think about your questions, maybe workshop those questions. And this could begin with things that are questions to you. Difficult passages. If you see an easy application from the theory to contemporary or historical events, questions like this. Critical questions where you vehemently disagree with the author. Once you've established a shared understanding of what they're talking about, then you can back off a little bit and criticize and engage in that kind of critical discussion with your peers. This is the sort of thing I'm looking for in a seminar. And I'll say, I think I've said this before, but this is important to note, anyone who's thinking about going on to grad school will be very well prepared for that prospect in terms of what we're doing here. And I kind of like the layout here. What we're going to do for this is we'll try to make sure everyone feels comfortable in terms of the spacing in here, but this sort of arrangement of tables, if we were to close the circle here, would be what you would normally see in a seminar room. And so that's what we're going to do. You won't be up here at the podium. You'll be at the table. I find that makes it a little more approachable to present on level with your peers. In that way, you'll have spent obviously more time with the text, but you're presenting it in a peer-to-peer way. That's the expectation here. You don't have to be an authority on the text. You'll have read it more often than your peers have, but that's the extent of it. Good day, Gavin. All right, are there any questions about the seminars? That's what I'd be amping up for at this point. Set this aside, think about the seminars, and we'll get started on that. All right, if you'll indulge, I would just like to read a little bit, and I'll say here also, I try not to do this too much, and you may want to think about this for your seminar. It's best if you don't read it verbatim. It tends not to be as engaging as if you have points where you can look up, make eye contact and have some back and forth with your peers. That's more like real discussion than reading from a page, which can tend to be a little bit robotic. I'll try not to be robotic about this, but I just, if you'll indulge, I'd just like to provide some context in terms of what Hegel is doing here in Reason in History. I'd like to talk a little bit about something perhaps more broad, and that is meaning in history. And begin with a claim here, and hopefully this is familiar. As long as humans have been human, we have always told stories to make sense of our experiences, to collect our memories together, and to find origins of the present and the past. There's something distinctly human about that storytelling and history telling. Why do we do this? You could ask critically, isn't the present, with its immediacy, its direct circuit to the brain through the senses, isn't this more sure than fading memories of past experiences, imperfectly recollected? Doesn't the urge to tell a story necessarily dim the reality of causes by forcing actual events into the constraints of an overarching narrative? The need for a definite beginning, middle, and end, and the storyteller's need for a punchline. Isn't this sort of grand narrative dimension of history telling, which is especially prominent in Hegel, perhaps this gets us away from the underlying reality of events that we're trying to describe? And yet we do love telling stories. Think about the punchline of a story, or of a joke for that matter, where the meaning finally hits you. This gives us, I think, a psychological clue as to the ground of the desire for history telling. The punchline builds upon contradictions that are contained in the story, the irreconcilable opposites that have produced tensions by standing together without being able to talk to one another, so to speak. This becomes especially important for Hegel, the idea that history is driven by contradictions. And so this tension is what makes us laugh if the story is a comedy and cry if it's a tragedy. We think, how can this be? This is outrageous. And when we finally get the joke, when we understand that meaning, this tension is released as the apparent contradictions are resolved in a burst of insight. Odysseus, Oedipus slept with his mother and killed his father. When you realize that, when there's that moment of apprehension in Oedipus Tyrannus and Oedipus Rex. Has anyone read this classical text? A few? Yeah. Or we're familiar with the story at least? It's that moment of realization that, this is what happened, where the underlying tragedy of events, how much more tragic is a story than that? That's when the meaning finally hits you. And when it's a comedy, we laugh. There's that ha 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 ha. Or if the story is tragic, we have the opposite of laughter, broken inward breaths, followed by that long sigh that lets go of the world and reconciles us with the incommensurability of human experience. One potential etymology of the Greek word tragedy is the song of a goat. It's one way of reading it. Song of a goat. Now, what could that possibly mean? It could mean that our words are like so many bleatings of goats, that human life is basically purposeless. The human experience is tragic, and we reconcile ourselves with that by crying. That's one reading of things. Now, not that all history is written as comedy in the sense of all's well that ends well, but the urge to historicize, I'd say, arises from the same psychological dispensations that make us laugh, the desire to see contradictions overcome, the wonder of where we come from, and even just our childlike fondness for being told and for telling stories. Now, the story that Hegel tells, though, is intended to go beyond merely being a story. And this becomes the real postmodern critique of Hegel, of progressivism, of historicism, of the idea of progress itself, is that this is nothing more than a grand narrative, a story that we've told to ourselves. But, you know, if you read Reason in History, we begin with the presupposition that we, just as humans, want to know the reason why. Like, what did this mean, if it meant anything at all? There's something, again, distinctly human about going searching for meaning in history, about going searching for our origins in history, about trying to see these contradictions that drive history forward resolved somehow. And that, for Hegel, is the token that there is reason in history, that we as human beings, first and foremost, go looking for it. It may be that these are stories we tell about ourselves, but we need those stories. Some would argue that we need this secular faith, that progress in politics is possible. Hegel's philosophical history is meant to go beyond just finding meaning in history. Its aim is to see reason unfolding in history. And to do so, Hegel takes the meaning set forth in various histories, in various moments in the history of ideas, and looks at them all together to see what reason connects those various moments of historical consciousness into a whole, what he calls world history. So this is core, especially to the first two chapters of Reason in History, how our understanding of reason itself has unfolded over time, with the idea being that that's where progress has occurred, in the unfolding of human self-consciousness in history. And, you know, not to ruin the joke, but the reason is freedom, ultimately, for Hegel. And you know, he's particularly unfunny because he does not let any real contradiction build up in that regard. He tells us from the very outset what reason in history is, and then through describing the contradictions that have gotten us there, unfolds in more depth and detail and more substance what that means. So to our question here, what is progress? What is progress? There's something much bigger at play in Hegel's understanding of progress than we find, for example, in Hobbes. I think most of us are familiar with Hobbes. We just talked about Hobbes in the other IR class earlier. You know, we're familiar with chapter 13 of Hobbes' Leviathan, the description of the state of nature there, and what progress could look like as a way of removing ourselves from that. You know, what is progress for Hobbes? How does he understand it? Yep.
Isn't it removing your, I can't remember, but removing yourself from the state of nature and then technologically. That's kind of
So first and foremost, removing yourself from the state of nature, we all acknowledge a social contract. I won't kill you, you don't kill me, I won't steal your stuff, you don't steal my stuff. And we acknowledge the sovereign power of the state as a means of enforcing that social contract, enforcing the laws. On that basis, with that modicum of security provided, we can go on to do better and better things. We can be assured that our industriousness will be rewarded. You wouldn't be industrious in the state of nature because you could, you know, build a table and then someone comes and steals your table. You wouldn't engage in culture of the earth, as he calls it, because you know, you plant your radishes and then someone comes along and steals your radishes. Why do anything? Yeah? So we have development in that economic sense, and with that economic development then too driving development in the sciences, and from there in the arts and in letters, the arts of navigation, all built upon that foundation provided by the state, security. It's a pretty low bar for progress, though, because, as we know for Kant, human nature doesn't change. And so in the absence of the effective sovereignty of the state, we are thrown back into the state of nature. Progress can be undone at any turn. You know, there's progress made in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, and we've seen that rather rapidly being undone women and girls effectively under house arrest by the Taliban. Um, some prognosis that we'll have 97% of the population living in poverty, not knowing where their next meal will come from. Just disastrous consequences, which seem to indicate what life in a failed state could look like. So progress for Hobbes is rather tenuous, again because human nature for Hobbes doesn't change. The moment the function of the security state is compromised, we are thrust back into the state of nature, and all the elements of economic, technological, and scientific progress are undone. That's that picture of progress, very limited. And so for Hobbes, our freedom from nature is always a provisional accomplishment. To understand historical progress in a more fulsome way, in a deeper way, one that might function beyond the borders of the state, one that might point us in the direction of a cosmopolitan future, or the kind of world history that Hegel is describing, we have to turn to the late moderns. And by late moderns, I mean those thinkers after Rousseau. So I would group thinkers like Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke in the early moderns, this category. Thinkers after Rousseau, like Kant, like Hegel, like Nietzsche, like Heidegger, late moderns. And what's distinctive is that for those late modern thinkers, human nature itself can improve over time. We can self-consciously shape who we are as human beings. Human nature of one age is not the human nature of another age. I'm paraphrasing Rousseau from the Social Contract there. This is their unique contribution to our conception of progress, that human nature itself can change. And that, in fact, our ideas of human nature, how we think about ourselves as human beings, these ideas are themselves the products of our particular stage of historical development. Our ideas, well, what Nietzsche will call our values, our ideas of the good, those unfold over time. And in so many ways, you know, in this set of lecture notes on Hegel's philosophy of history, his little volume written in history, this is again when he's turning to how have our ideas changed over time? How has our self-consciousness of ourselves changed over time? Progress is manifest in the unfolding ideas of human potential, i.e., what are human beings for?
Sorry, could you repeat that last thing?
Progress is marked by our unfolding ideas of human potential. What are human beings for? Those ideas change over time. So we know, you know, for Hobbes, the life of man in the state of nature is, what is the famous line? Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That doesn't change. For Aristotle, human beings are a zoon politikon or a zoon ekon. Human nature is fixed. For the Christian thinkers, the purpose of human beings is to love and serve God. That's fixed, that's eternal. Here suddenly we're introduced to the idea that, look, if we understand all of these ideas of human potential, what makes life worth living, perhaps we can see a pattern unfolding. And the pattern that Hegel sees unfolding is human beings coming into consciousness of themselves as essentially free and equal beings. Now, but here's the sort of prejudice of this, we call this historicism. Which is, again, just simply that idea I was describing, that, you know, our ideas of the human good are not set, they're not transcendent, they're not given by God, they're not given by cosmological order, they're made by human beings. The prejudice implicit in Hegel is that he sees all of these earlier moments as kind of imperfectly anticipating our ideas of freedom. And so he recasts the whole tradition of Western political thought, and it is avowedly Western political thought, with the rest of the world having to catch up and match up with that model of what makes life worth living, through their global ascendancy, basically, in his view of the principles of the French Revolution. He sees all earlier moments as anticipating the present. He lives at the end of history. he is self-conscious of himself as a free and equal being. Now we know, a Christian thinker like Augustine doesn't see freedom as the purpose of what it means to be human. It means to turn your love from the city of man towards the city of God. That's what makes life worth living for St. Augustine. But Hegel will say, well, yeah, that's what he thought at that particular moment in time because his ideas were framed by his historical circumstance. But that was just an imperfect anticipation of true freedom. For a Christian, you're free after you die and when you ascend into heaven. Hegel says, well, we get an inkling of freedom there, but it would be better if we were free right here in this world and not have to wait to die in order to be free. Similarly, Plato says something very similar, actually. As Socrates say in the Crito, philosophy is learning how to die, to become one with the transcendent forms, with the idea of the good, to be freed from this mortal frame, this particular perspective on the world, this particular time in the world. And so philosophy is a way of attuning ourselves to the rational order of things so that we can peacefully and calmly pass on to this next world. Hegel will say, well, that's a kind of freedom there too. But again, not a very satisfying one for us living mortal creatures. Or the Stoics, for that matter. Yeah, the world doesn't really mean much of anything, but we can stoically steel ourselves against the difficulties of the world. Yeah, they want to be free too. They're just toughing it out under difficult circumstances. The point for Hegel is to be free in this world, and all earlier moments in the history of ideas were mere preparations for this full realization of what human beings are for. And so that's what he wants to look at, how those ideas have changed over time, how our conceptions of human nature have changed over time. To take a kind of socialist critique of the early moderns, and I should say I'll get into this more later, but we have very left-wing readings of Hegel, figures like Marx, for example, or Kojève for that matter. And then we have other right-wing readings of Hegel which don't place the same emphasis. But a left-wing reading of Hegel, application of Hegel, would be to say, well, vis-a-vis Hobbes, okay, Hobbes says we're all basically self-interested, pleasure-seeking automatons. We desire our own security, and we like to hold on to our own stuff. Rousseau and Marx following them say that idea of human nature, that we're basically self-interested, is a product of a bourgeois property-owning society. And you can cast about for societies within which private ownership of property doesn't have that same place of prominence, and you'll find very different ideas of what makes human life worth living, or very different ideas of human nature that might involve a kind of sympathy for others, or a sense of solidarity with others, a love of the self extended beyond the self to the community as a whole. Again, our idea of human nature in that particular instance is a product of its historical circumstance. That's one of the bases of historicism, and that is a key idea that Hegel is introducing in this particular text. So not only is our conception of what is worth doing a kind of a sliding scale that changes through history, our idea of what makes us tick, that changes too through history. And so the question then becomes, how do we get better? Can we move beyond this conception of human purpose in terms of security, so as to accumulate property, so as to gather the technological and scientific means to accumulate more property, and so produce in order to consume, in order to produce in order to consume? Can we move beyond that and project beyond this particular horizon of possibilities and the specific forms of human nature that underlie it? Or more simply, how can we improve human nature? Are we perfectible in some way? And can that perfectibility unfold in a cumulative way over time? Not just within our own lifetime, but collectively. And I think I mentioned before as well, this is a key difference between modern enlightenment and classical enlightenment. The classics would say, yeah, you can improve education, proper use of leisure, good friends, living in a good community. All of these things can make us better, make us realize our potential. But that arc is limited to our own lifetime. Yeah? And beyond your personal enlightenment, things don't necessarily get better over time. The modern enlightenment hinges upon this idea that through advances in the sciences, through a growing apprehension that we are defined by our freedom, and this is the demand that we make of our states, recognize us as free and equal, that the popularization of scientific knowledge and the release from superstition, what Kant calls the self-incurred tutelage that would have us bowing to authorities even if we don't know why, that can't be taken back. Once people have the appetite for freedom, they're not willing to give it up again. And we can see progress unfolding over time, whether it's through reformist incremental means, as in Kant, or through more revolutionary and decisive means, as in Hegel. Now, the challenge in this project, if we admit that the human nature of one age is not the human nature of another age, that is, our basic motivations differ over time, and if we admit then too that, okay, that would have us reaching for different things at different moments, again, our values, our ideas of the good, if those change, the challenge becomes then, well, how would you judge what's worth doing? If these are historical phenomena, how do we get ourselves outside of that? Do you understand the dilemma here? For the classics, there's a transcendent standard, whether it's God or the good.
The goalposts keep moving.
The goalpost, yeah.
Completely objective standard. If our concept of good changes with time.
Yeah. And so how do we keep ourselves then from relativism? Just say, if our ideas of human nature and of what's worth doing change from time to time and from community to community, how do we arbitrate between them? What's really worth doing? How do human beings really behave? How do we answer that question? And even more dangerously, perhaps, if we think, as Nietzsche does, that these goods are human-made values that gain their force and their vivacity from being more impossible than the values that went before, how do we judge the things made by human beings? I think, now this is anticipated as jumping ahead a little bit into Nietzsche, but this is why Nietzsche, I think, is so important for understanding technology. Because in the idea of technological development, here we see this sort of endless unfolding of technical possibilities, kind of one horizon after another, increasingly delinked by any set conception of the human good. Like the things that we value, the things that we want, are not the things that the previous generation valued or wanted. And then you look forward and think, oh gosh. Although, now, did everyone here grow up with computers? Pretty much?
Yeah.
Do you remember a time before computers?
Yeah.
You do?
We got, usually for people like my age, 2001, we got
Okay.
maybe an iPod around grade 6, maybe.
Huh.
But that was the first.
2001, yeah, because it was just starting. Social media was
Yeah.
just starting. YouTube was 2006, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I remember, I was 6 and I got one of those big old beefy computers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's what I remember as my first one.
So more or less, we basically had the regular, we went outside and played, we weren't iPad kids yet.
Right.
So,
It wasn't so all pervasive. And so then we started looking forward to think, well, gosh, what will the next generation that was completely immersed in these technologies?
They're already like that. Kids get iPads before they even turn 2 years old.
Mm.
That's all they do.
It's crazy.
It's really crazy to think.
I think it is different. We can get into the details. I think the touchscreen is a very unique sort of mode of interacting that breaks down that boundary between reality and the artificial order of things. It feels like you're actually manipulating things in a way there. Yeah.
I was going to say, there is a thing between you'll hear insiders at Facebook talk about like brain hacking and stuff like that.
Mm.
They get you addicted
Mm-hmm.
to the technology and make it pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when Game Boy Colors first came out, there weren't really any colors on it. It was just shades of different things.
Mm.
And it was a long form game. It wasn't like you had to have patience and tenacity to play those games.
Mm-hmm.
Where now it's pretty quick.
Yeah.
It is fostering less focus
Yeah.
amongst the younger
Shorter
generation.
attention spans.
Shorter attention spans.
Fragmented focus. I don't know if you saw the piece out just recently in the Washington Post about the effect of Instagram on teenage girls. Did anyone read that piece in terms of? Yeah.
Well, there's a lot going on right now with like social media and how it's like making like regular everyday women feel about themselves and like
Mm-hmm.
how
Mm-hmm.
they should look, how they should present themselves.
What it means to be good, what it means to be a
Yeah.
good human being, is arbitrated by how many likes. I was struck. A student.
Removed
Yeah.
likes, right?
Now it's back.
It's
Yeah,
back
it's
now.
back.
Really?
They
Yes.
removed likes, what?
They removed it
Yeah.
for a while.
The
They
piece in
removed
the
it.
Washington Post was the one that was based on internal Facebook
Mm-hmm.
documents, right?
That they knew it was damaging
Yeah,
psychologically to
they had all
young
these
young
internal
women.
studies that showed it was damaging, and they still
Mm-hmm.
did it. Yeah.
That these curated ideas of the good life become the models that we use by which to judge ourselves and others too. Yeah? Our idea of the good has changed over time. And I just put that forward as an example of that distinctly open-ended idea of progress where you say, well, what is a like, really? What does that even mean? It's not something tasty. It's not something tactile. It's the subjective perceptions of others of you, and a sense of yourself then as an avatar within a social network rather than as a real lived experience in an embodied human being. Yeah.
I was going to say, it is kind of a nefarious reduction of us being social animals to kind of a mechanical action. You know
Huh.
what I mean?
Huh. How do you mean? Elaborate on that.
Like-
That's interesting.
Like being a social animal is a pretty complex experience. There's lots of things going on where you like to be around each other. There's all kinds of emotions.
Yeah.
But you almost reduce it to this mechanical action, clicking the button.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's how you kind of start to, it's almost, I don't know, I guess maybe weaponizing the social aspect of who we are against ourselves. I don't know.
It certainly cues
I
into
don't know
something.
how to phrase it.
Well, Hegel uses the language of recognition. He says that this is something that's unique to human beings in terms of what motivates us. We are social creatures because we want to be recognized by our fellow human beings. And politically speaking, we want to be recognized by the state, with certain rights and freedoms afforded to us. That gives us a sense of our own value in the eyes of the state and in the eyes of our fellow citizens, or fellow participants in one of these social media platforms. But I present this just as a very real example of how our ideas of what's worth doing, what's of value, what motivates human beings, this changes over time. And I think Nietzsche really gets that we can de-link the idea of progress from kind of old-fashioned liberal values, the freedom and equality of the individual. And this becomes especially hazardous then when you start to see technological development in regimes without that liberal tradition, authoritarian regimes, for example, with the development of the surveillance society, which has very different ideas of what's of value in terms of our collective accomplishments, in terms of what the state is for, with a much greater priority given obviously to security and social stability than to the recognition of the inherent rights of the individual. So our ideas of the good can and do change, and this problem arises then, well, how do we judge that sort of shifting set of standards? And Nietzsche's response is every new standard needs to be more demanding than the last, so that we can continually self-overcome ourselves, continually reinvent ourselves. I think that fits in well with a cyborg future, where there's no clear distinction between the technology and the human being. The technology is not, and I think it's pretty clear at this point, that technology is not a set of neutral tools external to us that allow us to be more free in the world. Technology shapes us and our very perception of who we are. It and it does that because it's an effective means of communication and of socialization. And we know, back to Aristotle, that being social, being able to communicate are two things that human beings are really drawn towards. Yeah?
Oh, I kind of lost it, but
Okay.
I guess I just was thinking about Heidegger
Mm,
and kind
mhm.
of how he talks about how technology shapes the way we think and stuff, viewing mountains as like a kind of a natural phenomenon, but it's constituent parts like the wood, the mineral,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. So this affects our perceptions, not just of our fellow human beings and of our relation to the state, but more broadly our conception of nature. I think you're right on there. You know, it's hard to understand nature as matter and motion subject to forces, stuff, basically, and to look at a mountain as a sacred place where the gods dwell. Those two ideas of nature are irreconcilable. You know? So if the Greeks were to look at Mount Olympus and say, yep, that's where Zeus is, for us this seems like just a bizarre fantasy with no footing in reality whatsoever. You know? And of course Heidegger, kind of poetic, kind of with an appetite, I think, for mythic thinking, tries to resuscitate that sense that something is present in nature and is announcing itself. But we're moving well beyond now. At least when we're talking about Nietzsche, he's on the reading list. But yeah, Heidegger is beyond. That said, I think the most important thinker of the 20th century for understanding what is technology, what is the essence of technology. And very much coming out of the same tradition, very much also a radical historicist after the fashion of Nietzsche. And even more radical in the way because, you know, Nietzsche at least says, yeah, we have these standards for ourselves, we make them, you know, as just horizons of self-overcoming. And that's what freedom is, to reinvent ourselves in that fashion. Heidegger even delinks history from freedom. He says that it could mean a complete closure of the historical spirit to the given, to being, and has this kind of apocalyptic sensibility to him, according to some readings at least. But back to Hegel here. I would point to this as a kind of a high watermark for modernity, for this spirit of enlightenment, this really secular faith that progress occurs in human history, that there is such a thing as world history, and that human beings have become more free through the course of that. That's the purpose of history. That's the reason in history that he sees unfolding, driven from within by inherent contradictions that exist within history. The most significant of which is, at least according to Marxist readings of Hegel, the master-slave dialectic. Wherever there are relations where one party is free because of the labor done by another, where one party can lord it over another class, and where that underclass then sees their freedom in the master class. Wherever there's that contradiction, a kind of divided sense of freedom, where, you know, masters need slaves in order to be free, they're dependent in that sense, and slaves look on the masters and say, wouldn't that be sweet, not to have to labor, to be able to, well, what are the kinds of things that masters do? They prance about in front of other masters, they go to parties, they ride horses, hot tubs, polo, you know, things like that. And so the slaves say, that's what freedom looks like, and that's what I'm going to reclaim for myself. It's that basic contradiction that moves history along from within, and that moves it towards particularly violent, revolutionary, and warlike means. And so the approach that Hegel brings to this challenge of late modernity, how do we judge historical progress, is to think of history as this immanent, self-moving dynamic, with the various historical modes of consciousness, what are historicized ideas of human potential, each containing their own specific contradictions, and with every human nature suggesting its own self-overcoming, to the end of the global realization of human beings as essentially free and equal beings. Okay, that's the overview. Any questions on that sort of meta-analysis of what Hegel is trying to accomplish in this text, what this idea of history entails? Shall we start diving into the text then in some depth and detail. Yeah. So reason and history. So what we have is the introduction to a series of Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history. What we have in hand there are literally his lecture notes combined with the notes of his students, combined with interpolations from later editors. Right? And this was delivered in the year before his death in 1831. And so our text consists of 3 earlier editions. We have the Gans edition of 1837, an edition from 1840 put together by Hegel's son Karl, and George Lassen's 3rd edition from 1917. And just to let you know what you're looking at there, because the text varies a little bit. You have some normal text, you have some italicized text, you have some footnotes that are indicated by author. So the main text is from the 2nd edition. The bracketed and italicized text are from the 3rd. Well, things that only occurred in the 1st edition but were left out of later editions are included as footnotes, again, designated author. Just as a point of kind of scholarly interest there if you're trying to navigate through the words on the page. I think it's just fascinating to imagine, though, like walking into a class and this is the course, what you're reading right there. Yeah? And to think also then, too, that students were active collaborators in the production of the text that you have in hand.
I wonder how good the lecture notes were. It's my ending normal student lecture notes. I think 5 sentences every 5 minutes.
Well, and then to imagine, too, that, yeah, can you imagine your lecture notes being part of some cumulative product in the future? Maybe that...
4 sentences, you don't want them.
Okay. Well, at least you're honest. At least you're honest there. There you go. There you go. I will say too. I would say too. You know, I do put my lecture notes up on Blackboard. Please don't distribute them because I do hope to publish on this. And actually, pretty much everything that I publish comes out of what's happened in classes. I find it super helpful. Thank you so much to be able to like workshop these ideas and to say, does this make any sense? When I ask that, I'm really looking for a response, and a head shake is.
Can we ask for
Royalties.
royalties?
I will show you. I had a. This is funny, actually. Yeah, the academic publishing is not a way to get rich. That's for sure. I had a check for $1.37 that I put it up on the fridge. You know, like when you bring home an assignment for your mom and say, "Look, Mom, look what I did." $1.37. Yeah, and the electronic copies now too. The model is not good for authors. That's not why we're doing this, though. That's clearly not why we're doing this. There you go. There you go.
We got a whole $2 here, and everyone gets a 2-cent royalty.
So let's turn to the text, and I'll say that the breakdown of the text was introduced by later editors, but it's helpful, I think. So we begin with this subtitle, "The 3 Methods of Writing History." The 3 methods. Grammar is really important. Nietzsche says, "I fear we have not gotten rid of God because we still have grammar." What does the definitive article "the" mean in that title? Yeah. These are the only 3 ways. Yeah, I love going back to Hegel because you just do not see writing like this anymore. This is so unfashionable now. I'll just be very honest with you within academia. The way I see academia generally going is to smaller and smaller truth claims, calling these big truth claims into question, looking at the particularity of experience, especially in history telling too. You know, to look at one person's experience of this particular event as opposed to Gibbon's rise and fall of the Roman Empire. You know, that sort of grand narrative history. But this is again the sort of the peak modernity that we're dealing with right here in terms of there being a grand narrative. These are the 3 methods of writing history. So right away we get a clear sense that this account claims to be comprehensive. It's complete. I'll note too the importance of there being three. Hegel's dialectic, it's called How History Unfolds, the kind of speech that occurs through history from age to age, is broken down into three. And we see this tripartite division coming up again and again in the Hegelian dialectic. The dialectic comes in threes. And the pattern looks like this. We start with a thesis. And a thesis in the sense of something is given. It just is. There's some object that's present before us. It's the original condition. It's the original history, and it's telling of the three kinds of history here. There's something just immediately present. The second moment in the dialectic is the antithesis. This is the stepping back from the given. This is when you say no to what just is. This is when human beings too begin to assert their freedom and their self-consciousness, to say that we're not just awash in what's given to us, that we can assert ourselves and step back from what is immediately present. And then the third moment in the dialectic is the synthesis. This moment, and this is often neglected, especially in left-wing accounts, the attempt to retrieve that sense of the given, to restore a sense of the wholeness of the community or of the family. Those are, politically speaking, things that are for us givens. Yeah, choose your family very wisely. Your family is just—that's what you inherit. That's what just is. Yeah. Similarly, your community. Now you can move from this community to that, but it's a given for us. This is where we live. I could choose North Bay to go this way or that, but here's what we have, and we can have that moment of antithesis. But there is that givenness to both of these phenomena, and in this moment of synthesis, Hegel tries to retrieve that sense of the given, and part of this too is informed by his experience of the French Revolution, with that moment, that violent moment of antithesis. That negation of the given. He describes freedom in those terms as a way of negating what's given, spilling off into endless, pointless violence. At a point, we need to retrieve the basis of our community with our fellow human beings and put the world back together. This is just a kind of thumbnail sketch of the Hegelian dialectic, but you'll see this keep cropping up again and again. Hegel's a systematic thinker. Systematic thinkers are often tough nuts to crack to begin with. It's obviously very deep. It's a dense text, yeah. But the benefit of these systematic thinkers like Hegel or like Aristotle, for example, is once you get the system, everything makes sense. You can keep on reading that author, and it looks more substantial, more real at every turn. Another way of understanding this division between thesis and antithesis is in terms of the division between object and subject. The objective quality of nature. Gravity, for example, is just an objective given. Objects, when it's dropped in the Earth's gravitational field, fall at 9.8 meters per second squared. That just is. There's no complaining about that. Well, you can complain about it, but no one cares. Complaining about gravity. There's that sense of the naturalness, the objectiveness of the thesis, distinguished from the freedom of our subjective being, or what Hegel describes as spirit. Another way of describing that same division is as the division between necessity on the one hand and freedom on the other. We'll come back to this. We'll come back to this dialectic throughout. In terms of his focus on methods, we have three methods, the three methods of writing history. This aligns with the modern focus on methodology, on the truth as a verum factum, as something that we have made for ourselves, on including a focus on the subject who perceives history, where the spirit of history becomes self-conscious through its expression. It becomes self-conscious through us. It's as if history as a whole becomes conscious through the historian. And just to read from this, it says, the subject of these lectures is the philosophy of world history. So not just what happened, but the philosophy of what happened, what it means, what are its reasons. This means that we are not concerned with general deductions drawn from history, illustrated by particular examples from it. We're not concerned with general deductions drawn from history, illustrated by particular examples from it. What does he mean by that? How would you interpret that? He says, we're not concerned with general deductions drawn from history, illustrated by particular examples from it, but with the nature of history itself. Yeah?
Well, I think it means less of more of how the narratives we tell in history rather than the specific events in it.
So, but you could take specific events and you could draw general deductions from them. Right? You could say, for example, let me think of an example here. Peloponnesian War, that's a great example, sure. You could say that the growth of the power of Athens and the fear that this inspired in Sparta made the war inevitable. There's a particular event, growing conflict between these two superpowers on the Mediterranean, and he tells us, Thucydides tells us, and that's the first historian actually that Hegel uses here, he deduces something about the balance of power from that particular event. Lesson learned. Yeah? And that's a very old way of approaching history, that there are certain perennial questions or perennial truths, and we can glean from these specific examples indications that those truths are real and resonant, were true then, and are true now as well. Yeah? We can draw these deductions. But that's not what he's trying to do. He's talking about the nature of history itself, as if history has a nature, as if there's an overarching whole that we can use to understand, well, historical progress taken on that scale. Not just the significance of particular events that could be used to inform our experience. This is how Machiavelli uses history too. You know, he casts about for examples of great princes, and other uses them as examples of what to do or what not to do. No, that's not what Hegel is doing here. Saying, what does it mean as a whole? How do we understand progress?
Is that his way of, I guess, creating that division between how we understand history as an example of the things that make us, or sort of the nature of human beings, and then sort of create a division to think differently, that it's not just base examples of what maybe certain thinkers thought at those times, but
Just to light on your last point there, what thinkers thought at various points in time, he wants to gather those all together and say that there's a kind of an unfolding pattern that's occurring from the past to the present to the future. We can stand back from the perspective of the end, and we'll get to this in a moment, and see meaning in history on the grandest scale, and on a world scale too, to say that there's progress occurring globally. We can trace it right back to, well, Thucydides is the origin that's pointed to here, and we can connect the dots. Now there may be kind of blank pages, as he calls them, in history in between. There may be things that are irrelevant that we'll get into in a moment, but there is an overarching arc of history. Something like the idea of progress as a secular faith is at play when we can see history in one view, taken as a whole. So Hegel doesn't string together particular events within history. He looks at history itself. Here he starts with the study of history, how we study history over time, how this changes, how this unfolds, how the idea of history shows itself to human beings. And this is important because it has to come into our self-consciousness. And it's those ideas, that unfolding self-consciousness, that really moves history along and ultimately becomes the point of it too. It's both the immanent driver of history. The slave becomes conscious of their freedom in the master and reclaims it for themselves. And it's the end too. That, the point of history, the kind of whoa moment, is when we all say, yeah, I'm a free and equal being. And I recognize all of you as the same. So it's both the end and the means in that way. It's an immanently derived history. It's not like Kant's transcendentally derived history, where we have this ideal that's outside of history, and we kind of imagine what that ideal is, and that we maybe can move things a little closer to it incrementally over time. This is moved from within, and that's why it can come to an end as well, because it's moved by these contradictions within towards the self-consciousness of human beings. And so here we have three kinds of history, three moments of the dialectic that are presented. We have original history, we have reflective history, and we have philosophical history. Corresponding to original history, thesis, reflective history, antithesis, philosophical history, synthesis. Original history, here's what happened to me, Thucydides, an Athenian. Antithesis of reflective history has various kinds that he describes. Anytime that we step back and say, did that really happen? Is this, looking at historiography, I know we have some historians in the room, yeah? In terms of what's the veracity of history, how do we approach history, sort of critical questions, yeah?
I was wondering, with then, like what we do with Thucydides in origins of, getting back to origins of international relations, would that be antithesis then? Would that be reflective history? How we kind of read out of him?
It's interesting. I take him as an original historian. In terms of how I treat him.
Oh, yeah, I'm not, I guess, questioning Thucydides.
Yeah, in terms of what we do.
Are the act in class of what we do, would that be?
See, I'm inclined to think, I'm not completely convinced by Hegel. I'm trying to present him as convincing a way as possible. And that's our first task always. Before we start naysaying a thinker, you need to understand them as they understood themselves. And then once you get on to critique, it's more substantive because you're not taking down a straw man. You're encountering the thinker themselves. I think there's something to what Thucydides does. I think there's something to original history, that we may be able to read perennial truths out of historical events. This idea that history kind of rhymes. That doesn't necessarily repeat, but it may rhyme from event to event. I find that attractive. And I think there's something that endures about these ancient texts. That said, the challenge I'd put to myself, I guess, there would be to say, could we countenance the behavior of the Athenians towards the Melians today? Could we just say that we're going to kill you all, we're going to colonize your island and eradicate your people just because we can? It seems that progress has occurred in politics, at least to the extent that you need to give an excuse or some sort of pretext as to why genocide is occurring under the circumstance. And the Athenians were rather blithe about it. So it seems like progress has occurred from that time, and yet certain things still keep cropping up in the history of ideas. But yeah, we have these three kinds of history, beginning with the immediacy of sense experience. Here's what happened. Here's what it's like to have the plague. And Thucydides will go through that because he himself had the plague, and he saw his fellow Athenians dying in droves around him, and Athenian society coming apart as a consequence of that.
What did he die of?
I don't know what he died of. He didn't die of the plague. He survived that.
I think he literally just randomly died one day because the book just ends, so he was probably still editing the book when he died.
Yeah, that's an interesting. And to be honest with you, and we've talked about this elsewhere, I don't pay a whole heck of a lot of attention to biographies as being illustrative of the ideas. I think let's get into what a person wrote rather than trying to reduce their ideas to underlying biographical circumstances. I've said this before, that these thinkers transcend their moment in time, and that's why we still read them.
I mean, he literally, the book ends in the middle of a sentence.
Yeah, that's interesting. Did
He
you?
had sacrificed
It could just be a
Artemis,
lost fragment, though.
dot,
Doesn't
dot,
mean he
dot.
died right there.
Sorry?
It could just be a lost fragment. Doesn't mean it's
Mhm.
he died right in the middle of
But
it.
even within the book.
onto the
Yeah,
papyrus.
it's like-
Boom. Thucydides out. Yeah.
Book 7 and 8 are like a lot. They're worse. They're of lesser quality than the earlier books too. It's not like he spent more time editing the first books than the last ones. Because the first ones had more dialogues, more grammar.
Hmm.
The last one was he just describes things and moves on quickly.
Hmm. Hmm.
Interesting.
Probably old.
We ran out of ink.
Okay, now I'm done.
But the point for Hegel is this first person account version of history. Yeah? I have seen these events with my eyes. I've heard these speeches with my ears. And now we know that, how could he have made an accurate rendition of Pericles' funeral oration or this or that? And he admits, Thucydides admits that not everything is there. This is kind of a curated experience of the war. If you're a geographer and you were to map everything out, eventually the map would become like the world that you're trying to map, and that wouldn't be particularly useful at that point. It has to be abbreviated, at least in some sense. And what's important for Hegel here, it's on page 3. So they, original historians, primarily describe the actions, events, and conditions which they had before their own eyes and whose spirit they shared. They transferred what was externally present into the realm of mental representation. So there's external sense experience, something happening in the world out there. I like Gad Horowitz, philosopher from York University, describes it in these terms. He says, something is going on. Let's begin with that. That's a very solid epistemological claim. It's not saying a whole heck of a lot, but something is going on. There are events.
Can I start my essay with that? Something is going on in this paper.
Something is going on in this paper. Then you would elaborate from there. Yeah, what is going
So
on?
my final paper is something is going on with Hegel, and it's just 8 blank pages that I handed him.
No,
Oh my
no.
God.
I'm looking.
Hegel's only comment is something is going on in this paper.
Yeah, I'm looking for more of an event in terms of the something that is going on.
Some event is going on. Sound?
Pardon me?
Some event is going on.
Well, then the essay needs to become the event, doesn't it? Yeah, yeah. And so what he's saying here, and this is it's a very simple point, but it's important. There's this externally present event, and it's being transferred into mental representations, ideas in the mind of Thucydides. Yeah? He's subjectivizing it. And so then we can start asking questions. Well, we know he's an Athenian. How does that affect his subjective perspective? But it needs to come inside first. It needs to be humanized in that way first. And this is important for Hegel because he uses this as a point of distinction to disavow myth as history. There's a strict distinction here, and he says, we're not even going to talk about myth because it doesn't include this element of self-consciousness. It doesn't involve this first meeting of the object and the subject that is required in order for history to move on, to get somewhere, to progress. And because of this, myth doesn't count. Bottom of page 3, and this is a kind of notorious passage. I'd be interested in your take on this. Myths, folk songs, traditions are not part of original history. They are still obscure modes and peculiar to obscure people. Here we deal with peoples who knew who they were self-conscious, and what they wanted, driven to certain subjective preferences, whatever they happen to be. Observed and observable reality is a more solid foundation for history than the transience of myths and epics. Yeah?
I agree. I think myths, epics read more philosophical history. It's trying to make the review of ideas into ways to live life. That's not really history. That's more of what we call ideology. Not objective in any way.
It's not objective. Why is it not objective?
Because it's based off, let's just take like a random legend. It's not based off an accurate retelling, like Legend of King Arthur. It's a romanticized retelling of a story.
It's a story.
To
Okay.
install some sense of morals or lessons in the reader. It's not objective. It's trying to push on a certain culture or a certain way of life.
So yeah, there is this dimension as well for Hegel that myths don't refer to an objective reality. The myth is the story.
Like
It-
the French canoe of people in a flying canoe. I don't think that really happened. What was that called then?
God, I wish I remembered, man.
You remember there was one about like a flying canoe, right?
Yes, I remember exactly what story you're talking about, but I don't remember what it's called.
Maudit, I think it's on a bottle of French Quebecois beer,
I
right?
can Google it.
Yeah.
Um,
Anyways, you had an addition here. Yeah.
The comment I was going to make is that don't a lot of indigenous peoples tell their histories through stories, oral histories, songs, stuff like that?
Yes.
Kind of an interesting result.
Or you know,
It's also how the Europeans did it for a long time.
that's how the Greeks did it as well. You know, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Those are stories that Homer was not present to tell about. He's talking about a golden age that happened in the far distant past.
I don't think there was Cyclops on a bunch of islands that tried to eat people fleeing from Anatolia. I'm just saying that. I don't think that's a historical fact.
There's these fantastical elements, yeah.
Well, like, I kind of see it like they used myths or stories to like tell what was reality, like at the time. Like in the myths, like they use myth as a mode of speaking the truth of what, like their reality of what happened. Like even though it's in myth form, it was like that is how they recorded the truth, I guess. Or
Yeah.
maybe not truth is like the right word to say, but
It's interesting, you know, if you go back in the ancient Greek and look at the word for myth, mythos, and look at how Homer uses the word mythos. The Liddell and Scott lexicon, the big one at the library, is so great because it tells you a whole bunch of different usages of the term and how that term then changed over time. Right? And when Homer uses myth, he uses it in such a way, in such a context that implies truth. You know, someone will say, for example, when Odysseus shows up, tell me your myth, and tell the whole thing, don't leave anything out, with the implication being that that story is the truth of Odysseus and what makes him who he is. Yeah?
I just wanted to say a quick example because I really like the way you said that. I think a popular example would be from the Bible when when Moses parts the Red Sea. I think that's probably just their way of explaining tides. Like the tide went down and the tide came up.
Then it took them 40 years to get to Israel.
Because they didn't part the Red Sea probably,
Yeah.
but maybe God graced them with the ability to cross the sea at low tide.
Isn't that kind of a patronizing attitude, though, to take towards myth, to say that they didn't, it's kind of like imperfect science. You know? There was some scientific truth, but they couldn't give an account for it yet, so they told the story instead. I think there's something patronizing about that. Yeah.
I don't think it is. I agree with Hegel. Myths and history, I just see it as, well, it's no different than philosophy. Myths is, the Bible is just really Plato's philosophy taken on a slightly different angle. It's stories meant to involve philosophical elements.
There are myths in Plato. Plato uses them all the time. Although that said, when we talk about the word for truth, mythos was the word for truth for Homer. And it is replaced quite self-consciously by Plato with logos. The word for truth changes, and myth, after Plato's critique of Homer, becomes a mere story, a kind of fantasy. And in part because he's talking about things that he cannot possibly know. He's talking about events that happened many generations ago when human beings were like giants compared to human beings now, referring again to a kind of a golden age where the fighters were all stronger than we are now. And he's talking from a perspective of kind of a fallen people reflecting on their great past.
Minus names, I believe, right?
And again, they were pointing to who they really were.
We don't think they were giants. We thought they were probably even shorter than the Greeks.
But you know how storytelling goes. Sometimes as you elaborate on this story, the fish get a little bit bigger, the events get a little bit more compelling. Storytelling tries to enliven the audience in that way too.
Well, I was going to say, if we're gonna talk about imperfect truths,
Yeah.
you could say that you could probably make an argument that they were giants because one of the things about agricultural communities is that they shrink due to a less nutritious diet. Because
Okay.
You're eating cereals,
Mm.
so you're not getting all the nutrition you need to become a.
Mm.
I think anthropologically, the Mycenaeans were actually probably either on the same height or a bit shorter than the ancient Greeks.
Yeah. But the point here is that he couldn't have known these things. He couldn't have known these things. And if we're telling stories, like the myths of the Titans, or the original union of heaven and earth, Uranus and Gaia, and the succession onto the various gods down through Kronos onto Zeus, how can anyone know those things? How can you tell me stories about the gods and claim any epistemological footing there?
Were Greeks allowed, like in ancient Greece, were they allowed or able to climb Mount Olympus? Like, was it something they could do?
That's an interesting question.
Like, could they physically go up there? Was it like too difficult to climb or something?
I don't know.
There are locations that are associated with where the gods dwell,
Yeah.
where people go, but they put an altar. So I think
Yeah.
it might be a little more. Their understanding may have been a little more, I guess, omniscient. I guess maybe.
So this would
Than
be.
we give them credit for.
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily as literal as we often perceive it to be.
Yeah, this sort of tendency towards literalism says a lot about how we understand truth. A story can be true, even if you can't trace it to an actual historical event that happened as the story says it happened. Stories have a sense of meaning. They tell us about virtuous behavior, tell us about vicious behavior as well. They're instructive, and they're also intergenerational. These are stories that have been passed on from generation to generation to generation, with Homer really at the cusp between an oral and a written tradition, taking what were essentially campfire stories that had been promoted through the generations, and starting to write them down. Yeah.
I was just gonna say there's I think that there's a matter that because a lot of the way these people think is now lost because those cultures don't exist, like the dots, it doesn't exist, like the spontaneous thoughts that you would have. Maybe a lot's lost in translation. There's an indigenous community in Southwest America, and they talk about how they came from a specific mountain. That's where they were created. And there's a lot of talk about what it means and all these different things. And I often think, like, what if they understood it to mean that when they came to this mountain, there was a spiritual awakening, and they were fundamentally different people, so they were created by the event of experiencing that place.
But again, then we're immediately trying to shoehorn this mythic sensibility into some sense of an objective underlying reality, which would be the real truth of that.
And you could also like, hey, that's a cool mountain. Let's make it our tribe's origin story.
Or I think of, in terms of Finland, my background, the Kalevala, the national myth there, interestingly composed by a Swedish doctor who was going around to these remote Finnish villages and hearing the same characters come up in various stories, and wrote it down. And out of that, we have the birth of Finnish nationality, really, and language as well, because there's a story. The story is constitutive of the people. The story makes the people who they are. Without that story, there would be no Finnish language. There would be no cohesive sense of identity. So the story, it becomes real every time it's repeated. The people tell themselves who they are through the repetition of their story in that sense. That's the truth of myth in many ways.
It'll still be real, as in it has an effect, but it doesn't mean it's objective, if that makes sense.
Objective. Well, the very idea of a separation between the objective and the subjective, which is so important for the moderns, which is so important for Hegel, is not yet present. And again, for Plato, when he starts to say, these are mere stories, and what constitutes a true story is the ability to give an account of yourself and to say, how do you know the things that you know? How does Homer claim to know the things that he knows? Odyssey begins, sing muse. And he says this at a number of points in the text. He says, no human being could know the things that I'm saying right now. You'd have to have 100 tongues, yeah, to be able to give the list, even of the ships at the beach at Troy. He says, a muse is speaking through me. Yeah? The muses. Yeah, there's some divinity that's speaking through him when he repeats this story that's been retold over the generations.
Maybe that's creativity, and he's like, this creativity must be the gods trying to tell me something.
The gods are always present too. Like we talked about the division between subject and object. If we go back to Homer, anytime someone does something exceptional, a god is present in them.
Yeah, so the gods have shown me this. It could have just him being creative, and the way he saw it back then, creativity was a god taking over your consciousness. To
Yeah.
do something.
Yeah, so we think about creativity in terms of our own subjectivity. That's when you're being creative, you're being authentically you. You know, that's you talking. Not so for Homer. When he's being creative, he's giving himself over to this other voice. And even down to, Ernst Cassirer is a great writer on this, Mircea Eliade on myth. If you're interested in the topic, I did my PhD thesis on this. Fascinating sort of branch of philosophy, its original encounter with myth. They give examples like, someone is hungry. Is the god of hunger in you making you hungry? I'd think I'm hungry just because my belly's empty at this point. No, there's divinities are present in human beings. Again, the distinction between the subject, us, and the object, the world out there, is not really at play in this mythological mode of thinking. Yeah? We know that the gods can become human beings transform into animals. All of these distinctions that seem pretty basic for us are very fluid within the mythic sensibility. And that's partly why Hegel here says myth doesn't count as history. It's discriminatory to the extreme. It basically sets apart modern Western thought and gives it a great deal of privilege in relation to all that went before, or really all else in the context of world history. All those other stories don't count. This is the story that counts. And it's a matter then for all the rest to catch up to this model, which describes the free and equal individual as the arbiter of historical progress. All right. Maybe we should take a little break at this point. I know some of you need to staple some things. Some of you need to print some things. Now would be a good time to do that if you need to. All right. Thank you, sir. It is history in the making right now. That was an event. See? We shared in that event.
And it's an event the online students will never know.
Yeah.
No, actually not. You had to be there. Yeah. Okay. So let's light on this actually, because this is important. This is again why.
Okay. I like
No,
it.
it's just ironic that this is like happening right now.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is why Hegel begins history with this split between the object and the subject, and why he disallows myth from what he would call history. Myth for Hegel is prehistorical in the sense that history hasn't even gotten started yet through the separation of human beings conceived as subjects and the world of nature conceived as an underlying objective reality. There's also the fact that myths tend to repeat themselves and tend to enclose a people within the context of their relations with nature. They're not driven from the very outset towards the unfolding of human subjectivity understood in terms of freedom, as Hegel sees all other histories moving in that direction. And so here Hegel says that he does not need to give an account of myth, again, because it is not historical. Let's just consider that for a moment and ask, what are the consequences of neglecting myth from the outset as ahistorical and essentially untrue to the essence of humanity. What does that mean? How might we criticize the neglect of myth by Hegel here? Yeah?
Well, I feel like we look at myths that were present in like certain time periods, and that's how we get a sense of like who these people were, how they lived, how they thought, how they wrote their history. And if we just ignore that, then it's kind of like we're ignoring the part of like human history that like progresses. Well, I mean, but
It is. But he's so explicit about ignoring. He said that doesn't count as history. Yep.
Like it's erasing, like he's erasing history, which is, I don't know, I guess, a crime on its own.
Well,
History.
it certainly offers a premonition of how this progressive idea will unfold. If you start by saying that unless your history begins with the separation of subject and object, it doesn't count. If you're just repeating the same stories to yourself generation after generation, again, that's not going to get anywhere. And if you can't give an account of why you're saying the things you are, telling stories about the origins of the cosmos or the gods, which are incredibly common for myths, to have these cosmologies, how the world came into being. You can't, according to Hegel, say, I say these things because the muses told me so. In a way similar, actually, in terms of how the modern university functions, you can't, in your essay, say, I'm making these truth claims because some muse told me so. Maybe in fine arts, that there would be some allowance for that. But normally we would say, well, tell me the reasons why. Partly because of the legacy of Plato and the replacement of mythos by logos as the true word. Gavin? Yeah.
I was going to say, it's part of, well, maybe Hegel started to help create this, but it's part of that overarching aspect of modernity where you kind of almost dehumanize parts of society. Like you remove that kind of spiritual human aspect and you over-rationalize societies and systems. You kind of get that modern alienation. And I think it's at least a contributing factor to that.
Yeah, we see it in the language of, say, ahistorical peoples. Marx talks about backwardness, as an indication of this. It's as if there are some people who aren't yet in the stream of history. We'll see towards the end when he talks about world history, the attitude towards the Orient, for example, says that there isn't that same self-consciousness, there isn't the same drive towards freedom, and so there's an inclination to allow for what he calls Oriental despotism and the subservience to despotic governments, because they're not, again, in the stream of history in the same way that Western nations are. So it's absolutely discriminatory, yeah?
Well, first thing about this, isn't Hegel talking about original history specifically, not history in total?
He's saying that it starts with original history. It starts with Thucydides saying, Thucydides an Athenian. Well, it's still kind of weird that Thucydides talks about himself in the third person, but there's a moment of self-consciousness there where he identifies his perspective, he identifies who he is, and how he can know these things.
I think what he's trying to say is history is, for him, it's rationality to get to a certain point of spirituality and understanding who you are and freedom. In order to do that, you need rational, you need logic. Since myth is devoid of rationality, if we count it as history, it might delay the progress of getting to the end of history. As such, you need to get rid of it.
Well, and it does. Myths tend to, again, repeat themselves, and societies with that mythological basis reconstitute themselves every time their stories are told. And so there is that dimension here. This idea of progress becomes a very powerful one. Yeah?
Is it also, an attempt to just erase certain, like what you were just saying about how he's using, like his truth is the only truth, and so just trying to erase other forms of, other philosophies, I guess.
Here's a very concrete example of how this played out, how Hegelian understandings of history played out through Kojève and through Francis Fukuyama, who informed the American neoconservative moment. And you saw that it was the burden of the American empire to extend this model of liberal democracy and free market capitalism the world over. And there may be those who don't yet have the habits of freedom, may have become accustomed to living under tyrannical government, say in Iraq or in Iran or in North Korea. And so then it becomes a kind of spiritual mission almost of the United States to extend the freedom enjoyed in the United States to the rest of the world, to make the rest of the world nice Americans, essentially, playing catch up. And that idea, in terms of modernization theory, and is what it's referred to in economics, has been prevalent through the 20th century. Here's the model, and now the question is, how do we engage in technology transfers? How do we engage in foreign direct investment? How do we make investment funds available for infrastructure projects like dams, electrifying economies, this sort of thing, in order to bring the developing world into alignment with the developed world? So, it's a very basic idea at its origins here, but it's had profound consequences in terms of contemporary international relations and in terms of how we think about progress through the 20th to 21st century. Yeah?
So you would say that then the Western world, because of its march with progress, it's caught up, it's in history then?
It is in history, yeah.
Okay. It feels to me that oftentimes we view the world from outside of history, like the way you kind of perceive objective history is away. Do you know what I mean?
Well, and that's part of the problem that we began with. If our standards change over time, how do we judge our standards, our values, our understanding of human nature? Yeah.
Maybe architecture is a better example to get to it. We often look at, well, there's a difference between modern architecture, which feels ahistorical often, older architecture, which is very much steeped in the symbols, very much in the time it comes from.
Yeah.
And you can almost, if anyone's ever been to I went to Europe and you can feel the difference in a city that's older and is steeped in that history than a modern city.
If you're interested in architecture, I did my MA on modern architecture, and specifically Le Corbusier. Have you encountered this architect?
I know. I've read a lot about it.
Okay. Read Le Corbusier, because this is exactly, that's kind of high modernism in architecture. So just as a very concrete example,
What's it called again?
Le Corbusier is his name. Le Corbusier.
Look up his plans for Paris.
Well, look at the UN Secretariat building.
Oh, is that the one where you want to compare to a bunch of high-rises?
Yeah.
The glass skyscraper, Le Corbusier. The use of concrete as a building material, Le Corbusier. The house is a machine to live in, Le Corbusier. Yeah.
It's like how the Soviets conception in architecture.
Similar, Bauhaus. It's associated with the Bauhaus movement, yeah, which had Marxist influences in it as well. How do you make buildings as efficient as possible, with efficiency being the measure of progress? Yeah.
You know, watch the Soviet movie where it was like a romantic comedy, where the joke is this one guy accidentally takes the train to a different city, and he goes to the exact same street name, the exact same building, and the exact same house, and it's the exact same.
Yeah.
And he meets a girl there, and they do this romantic thing for like half an hour.
Okay. Well, I think we're all familiar with that. How lacking in uniqueness modern architecture can be. You go to one suburb, another suburb, one big box store, another big box store. They're all the same. It doesn't matter where you are. That particularity, that being in place in this specific spot. Now, this is the spot here. Like, there's no other spot that's quite like that. I've always been a little bit shocked by the kind of brutalist or modernist buildings that embank this. Although the one nice thing I'll say about them is when they reflect the pond, that looks nice, I think. It seems like it's in a good place. But,
It's not as nice as like saying, what's that school called, the big one? Oxford. Like Oxford is like.
I haven't been there. Yeah, I'd love to. But and this is why I'm thinking forward to Nietzsche and to Grant. Grant says that homelessness is a condition coeval with modernity. That it doesn't really matter where you are. If you look at the world as kind of a horizon of possibilities, there's no sense of the givenness of that particular space. This is one very real measure of our freedom. We see this in Kantian cosmopolitanism, that you can be who you are no matter where you happen to be in the world. And there is a kind of a leveling effect of that, where then every place looks kind of the same. Yeah.
Although a point in contrast, I think suburbs can still look different though. Like even in North Bay, the big difference is just the suburbs on the base versus the suburbs like say in Birchaven.
Mhm.
They feel different. The suburbs on the
Sure.
base, you can tell they're American, big sidings, barely any bricks.
Yeah.
Go to Birchaven, you got the old military houses and bricks, these big brick houses with a bunch of trees.
You do have different customs, different history, a different place that informs what you can do in that specific place. But this is what Le Corbusier is trying to level. This is what modern architecture tries to do away with by turning buildings into machines measured by efficiency to create this kind of homogeneous, universal and homogeneous global order. Yeah.
I was going to say, just to kind of drive the point home, is amongst modernists, there was kind of an idea to not even have windows, because there was no value in a window necessarily. And so they had to actually tell architects at one point, I forget what group it is, but they kind of have to say, no, you're putting in windows. That's extreme. That's ridiculous. And that's how rationalized the buildings are.
That reminds me of, again, the UN Secretariat building, one of the more famous glass skyscrapers. Has everyone seen this building? Kind of a rectangular shaped glass. And it was very new at the time to have these glass panels, not just windows. Pardon?
Like the UN building in New York?
The Secretariat building, yeah, where the work happens, yeah. And here, an interesting point of fact, at the time when they built it, the glazing technologies weren't very good in terms of being able to keep the light from shining right into the building. And Le Corbusier had designed it without draperies. And let's see. Looking at the right one? Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like that's a picture of modernity right there. You know, that's at the opposite end of the Temple of Apollo. You know, is what we're looking at there.
It's like reflective.
Yeah,
It's a mirror, and his intent was to kind of mirror. It's on the Hudson River, so he would sort of mirror the place. There's some nod to the situation there. Here's what happened though in the building: the actual secretaries who were working in the Secretariat building, because they didn't have blinds and because the glazing technology wasn't good, they got uncomfortably hot. There's kind of like the heat inside the building that needs to be accounted for somehow, and that rationality has a difficult time accommodating, quite literally accommodating that.
Rationality is the hard thing. Wait, building get hot.
So how do we rationalize all of our lived experience and still retain some measure of humanity, some sense of where are we, and how does that affect our identity? These become sort of responses to that spirit of high modernism. Yeah.
I mean, I get the point just because, I mean, look at modern day Dubai, it is, what I've heard is horrendously ugly. Dubai basically functions is, there's these giant skyscrapers that are self-contained communities, where all the shops and houses are all there in one building. So if you're a tourist walking from Dubai, it's like an ocean of roads that you're never stopping because there's no one ever on the side of the roads, and it's like the ugliest town ever.
Well, and we see that the idea that our cities are increasingly designed for cars more than they're designed for human beings. And this again gets to this point that technological development becomes increasingly delinked from human purposes. So we're kind of anticipating here the critiques of modernism and critiques of Hegel. Maybe we should get back to Hegel himself. So we have this first moment of history, this original history. The second is reflective history. And he defines that as history which transcends the present, not in time, but in spirit. So for Hegel, being a committed historicist, you cannot transcend your moment in history, but you can step back from what's given to your immediate sense experience. Say, am I being deceived, for example? Is my methodology in my historical study accurate? Are my subjective preferences intruding upon the story that I'm telling? And in doing this, transcending the immediacy of sense experience, one gains self-consciousness. You reflect, you turn back on oneself in order to see oneself. And to know also that one is seen by others through that. That's part of what you're imagining when you reflect on yourself. You're saying, how would others see me in this circumstance? Reflective histories all tend to abstract from their concrete content. He describes 4 kinds of reflective history: universal history, pragmatic history, critical history, and fragmentary history. Universal history would be something like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the whole history of that empire. And it contains original history as its material by abstracting from that material, connecting all those facts provided by original history and assembling them into a whole.
Or like your secondary sources, basically.
Yeah. You take your original sources, your primary sources, and then you start collecting them together. This is one way that we can reflect on history. Pragmatic history is another example that he uses. It's also an abstraction from the past. And it attempts to deduce universals from particulars. And he's quite critical. This is a very nice statement. This is on page 8. It's a very nice statement in his critique of pragmatic history, a very nice statement of historicism as such. So this page 8, third sentence in, it says, one often advises rulers, statesmen, and peoples to learn from the experiences of history. But what experience and history teach is that peoples and governments have never yet learned from history, let alone acted according to its lessons. Why is this? It is not because they didn't do a good job of it, it's because they can't. Every age has conditions of its own and is an individual situation. Decisions must and can be made only within and in accordance with the age itself. So critical history transcends history in spirit, though not in time. You can never abstract yourself, take yourself out of your particular moment in history, according to Hegel. In the turmoil of world affairs, no universal principle, no memory of a similar condition in the past can help us. A vague memory has no power against the vitality and freedom of the present. So you cannot abstract, according to Hegel here, enduring lessons from out of history that applied in the past, apply in the present, and may apply in the future. Nothing is more vain than that. Our thought and our possibility for action is contingent upon when we happen to be. Nothing is more shallow in this respect than the oft-repeated appeal to Greek and Roman examples during the French Revolution. Nothing is more different than the nature of these peoples and that of our own times. This is quite a significant statement. Nothing, what does this mean? Nothing is more different than the nature of these peoples, Greek and Romans and French during the Revolution, and that of our own times. What is Hegel saying there? Begins by saying you can't take lessons from the past and apply them in the present. Why is that? Yeah.
That our nature as human beings has changed since the time of the Greeks and Romans.
Yeah. And so, that dictum of realism, classical realism like Morgenthau or Thucydides, which is that we can learn from the past because there's something unchanging about human nature, that's disavowed by Hegel here. It's a fine statement of, again, historicism. Who we are, what motivates us, depends upon when we happen to be. Thought is always determined by its moment in history. What do we make of this? Is that true? We got a little bit of head shake.
This may be a little outside of what we're trying to get at, but I think we kind of know it's not true with modern biology and evolutionary science.
Oh.
People have certain instincts. It's how groups like Facebook can get people addicted to Facebook. They know how to leverage biology.
So you're saying the underlying biology is consistent from our time to earlier times, and therefore how you would sort of exert leverage over our interests, our aversions, our appetites remains consistent?
Yeah. People still feel the need for revenge in the modern era. They don't create blood feuds like they used to, but there's still a strong And there's still a strong sense for even nicer concepts like love, companionship. These things are constant throughout history. Those motives are constant. They don't change.
And recall, in terms of those two sort of polarized options that you present, that's how the first historicist, Rousseau, makes his interjection, saying that what Hobbes is saying about ourselves as appetitive creatures is not true. Human beings can improve. We can cultivate that sense of sympathy with others and improve over time. Yeah?
Yeah, I think also against that, it's like we do have, biology is difficult and hard to change, but humanity doesn't merely run on DNA. We have our neural networks. And the research we've done on neural networks shows that experience, new technologies, new political systems causes things in here to change slightly.
Mm-hmm.
We might be same genetically as our ancestors, but how our brains is wired is, at least in some level, different.
And we can come to know it as well. Like the very fact that we can come to know these neural networks in the ways that we do and exert influence over them, that we have these new, very powerful means of communication that can shape human behavior en masse, that suggests an ability, even if we do start with this objective underlying reality, our thesis, our given, our biology, we can step back from it, can't we? Can we reshape ourselves? Could we put a little implant, perhaps, that would affect the way our brain is wired? There's a very interesting program in the CBC suggesting a cure for depression, potentially, that would deep brain stimulation, implanting a little chip that would respond to the sort of neural networks that are indicative of an episode of depression and effectively, apparently, heal a person prone to depression. So we know that there's that biology, but maybe we could improve upon it through technological means.
Oh, I was just, I don't know, I don't know, I don't really buy into it. I guess I'm going to bring in another thinker, maybe Foucault.
Okay.
He talks about how we rationalize bodies
Mm.
when we overlay knowledge on them, and how you can then exploit in that grid the gaps to abuse people. Like, you can, once you understand what a psychosis is, you can then put them into, you can then justify locking them up and putting them through certain types of procedures that are, quite frankly, abusive. We think about older mental hospitals and so forth.
Yeah, and in terms of how we shape human behaviors for Foucault, of course, those institutions are so important. Schools, insane asylums, prisons, those are the means by which you shape human behavior and psychology, based upon some sort of understanding of an underlying reality there. Yeah?
I would agree, I still think the basis of figuring out neural networks and changes isn't really of a need to control, but more so of a need to overcome biology, per se. Because I think one fundamental thing that humans have wanted to do, so the ancient Greeks, when they're talking about artifices, is there was always a sense of beating biology at its own game, taking humanity and extracting it from biology so we can stand completely opposed to it. Because right now, even to this day, we're still bound by it to some extent.
I disagree. At least when we light upon the classical thinkers like Aristotle and Plato, the point is to realize human nature and the full potential of human nature, which is a given. We are animals. We're unique animals because we're animals that live in cities. We're animals that have logos, but we're still animals. That's our given. And to the extent that we become more political, more reasonable, we perfect the kind of animal that we are. That's the claim they're making. And artifacts for the ancient Greeks, techne, is not a means of removing ourselves from nature. It's just the kind of animal we are. We would get cold in a North Bay winter without warm jackets, techne, without roofs over our heads. Techne, original roots of techne referred to the weaving of reed roofs. Yeah?
I was just gonna say, not really in so much of a crazy literal sense, but I feel like nowadays with all the developments we have and all the information that we have access to, I think that sometimes maybe people forget that we're just animals and that we're not above everything else, and how they try to manipulate human brains and stuff like that. That's great, But like in like I just wonder how things are gonna progress from here, because there's been some crazy stuff. Like they're thinking you can like implant like a chip and like read text messages in your brain or something.
God.
Like,
Yeah.
and I just feel like
Yeah,
we're forgetting that like we are also animals, like
Hmm.
that
Yeah,
are
it's
not
right now.
above like our own like existence, like if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Is it,
Right now they're working on a pacemaker for your brain now. That's
Yeah.
well, that was that
Wow.
deep
They
brain
announced that this morning,
stimulation.
it was like a pacemaker that can kind of treat Alzheimer's, where you put it in
Mhm.
your brain and it keeps electromates moving.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Like I just hope we don't go too far, because you know,
I feel like no
Well,
matter
I
what
kinda
we
like the idea
will.
of the iPhone. That's
yeah.
kinda cool.
Ah.
iPhone phone.
I wonder how much longer until they start projecting ads into your eyes, or they make you feel like you want a Coca-Cola. Like it's not actually your own
Right.
decision to have one. It's,
Well, it
you know,
hasn't,
they're getting you to get rid of depression. How long until they get you to then want to buy something?
has it
Yeah.
ever been our decision though? Then that's the question. Whenever you feel thirsty for a Coca-Cola, was that ever your decision to begin with, or was that you being a slave to your biologic need for water?
Sugary, fizzy drinks. It,
Because
it
you're
seems
addicted
like
to
a pretty
sugar because
artificial
your brain
desire.
the sugar gives a almost like heroin gives you a dopamine boost. That's not really your decision to like sugar. That's wired in.
Yeah, but you know, there is
It's more efficient and scary. I give you that.
no, because I think at a certain level there's a biological reaction happening there, where the other one's a technological reaction, and it's
Yeah.
rather invasive.
Yeah. Keep in mind, and we are dealing with that very basic distinction here for Hegel between what's given, which is our objective kind of core animality, and our negation of that given, our stepping back from that given, our subjectivity, the assertion of our freedom to make ourselves in our own image. With the question once again being, well, how do we judge that outcome, and what would be a decent, humane outcome? You know?
Can I- just a-
Please, yeah.
So I suppose he would be in the camp of overcoming nature, right? Then, to a sense, it's not maybe
Yeah.
so extreme as
So you don't overcome, you don't get away from it entirely. It's still a given. There's still gravity. We're still terrestrial beings, although we can leave this planet now, which is remarkable.
think about, you know, you can maybe conquer death, but you can't actually conquer it because there's the heat death of the universe. Like you can't really ever escape nature.
Well, I mean,
The natural process is.
Yeah, yeah.
There actually is a theory to start reversing the heat death of the universe. That
Hmm.
came out like a year ago.
Oh, I don't know about this, but you know, it makes me think too, all this discussion of deep brain stimulation. There is a chapter in the Phenomenology of Spirit, his magnum opus, quite an involved text on phrenology, actually, indicating that how we think may be traceable to how the brain is actually composed. He didn't have a very solid understanding of it.
That was ahead of his time.
Well, at the time, phrenology meant like looking at little bumps and contusions on the skull and like tracing those to different propensities that we may have this way or that.
It's not actually that far off, though, considering that he's just one layer away from the actual brain.
In terms of, yeah, there's some underlying biology there. Measuring the size of crania and, you know, how intelligent will those various individuals be,
He's
this
going
sort of consideration.
headstrong towards eugenics, but
But,
But it is like the basis of
it is basically eugenics, but I
but,
mean,
but keep in mind that that's maybe the kind of objective basis of our humanity, but being fully human means stepping back from that and saying that you're not defined by who you are or what you are as an object. You're defined by your self-consciousness, not your whatness, but your who-ness,
so you can,
your subjectivity.
like Kant, there's something so innate that even if you're a race of devils, you're still human.
We'll get into that when we talk about the state and the nation state, and it's somewhat different than the social contract tradition, what he presents.
So like, I mean, it's like you can be the worst human ever, but you still have what it takes to be human.
No, not entirely, because, and we haven't got there yet, there's more of a discussion of the nation, the constitution of a national community with some sense of the same givenness that the family would have, a kind of Volkish territorial identity that, that will bring us back together from our isolated subjectivities. But that has to wait until chapter 3. So that comes a little later. And we're still on chapter 1. So here we are.
Chapter 2
we'll get there. I'm not too worried. Okay, we've been through two different types of reflective history. The third is critical history. We would describe this perhaps as historiography that judges the relative veracity of different histories. And it allows for the subjective interpretation to trump the so-called objective facts of history. He sees historiography spinning off further and further away from any underlying objective truth, becoming increasingly abstract. And he points to German history as being particularly prone to this. He says at bottom of C on page 9, says, here we have another method for gaining actuality from history, replacing historical data with subjective fancies which are held to be the more excellent, the bolder they are. That is, the smaller their factual basis and the larger their contradiction with the most basic facts of history. And this is the danger of the second moment in the dialectic. We get further and further away from any sense of the given whatsoever. When we spin off into these fantasies of imagining ourselves in an virtual reality, with no grounding in the world whatsoever, this is the kind of fantastical direction that Hegel sees this second moment inclining in. And at a point, we need to get back to the ground, back to reality. We need to synthesize this givenness along with our freedom. How do we have both? So we're not just completely isolated in little worlds of our own making. And again, the violence of the French Revolution is, in his mind, one indication of what that looks like politically. And then finally, there's this fourth kind of fragmentary history, also an abstraction, but held together by various themes. So you can have a history of art, a history of law, a history of religion. These are partial histories, but they are held together and given some substance by that unifying theme. He says that these are even the closest to the third kind, which is philosophical history. This third kind, he doesn't say much about the third kind here, philosophical history. It is the, he says, quote, thoughtful contemplation of history. Asking this question, what does this mean? What is the reason in history? This is philosophy which does not look to transcend history, as classical and medieval philosophy did, but which is the fruit of history, the kind of culmination of progress. Hegel himself is the culmination of progress, even to the extent that he claims not to be doing philosophy any longer, but to be wise. He says he moved beyond being a lover of wisdom. Rather, we have a comprehensive science of history. This is what he claims to be laying out before us. Comprehensive science of history, resolving the contradictions that existed in particular philosophies at earlier historical moments. And this is the history that the rest of the lectures elaborate upon. Let's move to this. I'd like to move, this is one of the more astonishing parts of the text here. This is on page 11 through page 12. It says reason as the basis of history. Reason as the basis of history. Not just the outcome of history, but the thing that moves it along. Both its form, the shape that it takes on, and its substance, what it is made of. History reason both moves through history and is its culmination. This is quite astonishing. Page 11, under reason as the basis of history, Hegel writes, the sole thought which philosophy brings to the treatment of history is the simple concept of reason. That reason is the law of the world, and that therefore in world history, things have come about rationally. Things have come about rationally. And this is what he asks of his readers. He says, well, students here, people listening to the lecture, he says, you're here because you're looking for the reason in history. That's an indication in and of itself. That we want to say, well, what does this mean? What's the point of all of this? That's an indication that we're suited not just to tell these stories, but the reason is moving through us in our subjective inclination to ask those questions. Um, bottom of the page there, those among you gentlemen, it would have been just men in the class at the time, who are not yet acquainted with philosophy could perhaps be asked to come to these lectures on world history with the belief in reason, with a desire or thirst for its insight. It is indeed this desire for rational insight, for cognition, and not merely for a collection of various facts, which ought to be presupposed as a subjective aspiration in the study of the sciences. So why do we, well, again, we've got some historians here. Why, do you have a question? Yeah.
No, I was going to try to answer, but go ahead.
Okay, no, hey, try to answer, yeah.
I don't.
Give-
That's the bit now I'm doubting myself.
Okay.
No answer a D there, Patrick.
Well, I thought it was. It's not. I want to say it's not. It's not just to. It seems like it's. You're learning it to know it,
Hmm.
but it seems like it's more than that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you want to know these things somehow. And it wouldn't be satisfying as a student of history, or a philosopher studying history in this instance, it wouldn't be satisfying to say, that happened, that happened, that happened, that happened. Didn't happen for any particular reason, it just happened to have happened.
Yeah.
That's not particularly satisfying for a student of history or for a philosopher.
Is it to know and understand? Perhaps?
Well, let's just lay on that. Why would that not be satisfying?
Sorry, can you just repeat it? I just want to hear his exact words.
He says, it is indeed this desire for rational insight, for cognition, and not merely for a collection of various facts, which ought to be presupposed as a subjective aspiration in the study of the sciences. So he's addressing his students, and he says, I think you're all here. The only reason why you really would be here is to know why things are the way they are, not otherwise. Why did things happen this way? What does it mean? And again, it would be particularly unsatisfying just to say stuff happened.
Like with science, like what's the purpose of science, I guess, is to not just, like if you were to study something, you'd want to know like if there was any hypothesis or like you'd want to understand more, like what's the reason that grass is green?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting in terms of science. I can't help but go back, and again, I'm trying to present Hegel as loyally as I can, but my affinities are deeply rooted in the classics. And when both Aristotle and Plato say that myth is like philosophy and that both begin in wonder. And I'd say the same thing about science. That science begins in wonder. Why is the grass green? Why is the sky blue? There's a kind of like slack-jawed, open-eyed, childish naivete to that is particularly human and particularly suited to the scientific endeavor. Know-it-alls don't make good scientists because it's not an inquisitive frame of mind. Yeah, wonder, just being awash in the world. And wonder implies that it's not interesting just because it's useful. It goes beyond, I could make use of that. It goes beyond a mere utilitarian attitude. Like there's nothing particularly useful about a clear night of stars shining. You could think like, how could we harness the power of the stars? And we could get there maybe, or not, who knows. But the experience itself of being something very small within something very large, within a larger ordered whole, and asking what is my place within this whole, I think that's the origin of all of these inquisitive acts, whatever form they take on. Yeah, so that's one reason why. He's not beginning with wonder, though. He begins with this question, what is this for? What is the reason? What is the reason why events have unfolded in the ways that they have? And he says that you all share in that as philosophically inclined students of history. Yeah?
But it seems almost contradictory because he'll say, he'll have his critiques of Thucydides, but you can't really know why the things unfolded unless you understand the way that, like, Athenians think. Same is true with Sparta, but that's harder because they didn't really have an affinity for writing. But it almost just seems contradictory because you can't truly know the objective history and understand why without understanding the kind of stories and how they viewed themselves in of themselves. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm being
But you've read Thucydides. There's some passages he'll say things like, in this year the Peloponnesians laid waste to Attica, and that's the history. There's no like, why did that happen? What does it mean? What does it tell us about them? It's just this is what happened, just the facts,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just like kind of like saying that really in other words. It's like we like you said at the beginning of the class, like we have to understand Hegel, like how he understood himself, and then
Exactly.
we can critique it. But
Yeah.
he's not doing the same for like other.
Huh. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. You got me. Yeah. There's okay. Yeah. This is true. This is something. There's a dissonance between the approach that I would take to the canon generally, which is that's exegesis. That's reading out of the text as opposed to reading into the text. Sort of recognizing that these thinkers are wiser than we are, and so we really try to get into their head. Yeah. Really try to think as they thought, and maybe put some critical distance between their way of thinking and the assumptions that we may begin with and not even be aware of. But it is an approach that's really informed by the classics, the sort of canonical approach. Hegel himself, you're right, does not take that approach. Hegel thinks he's wiser than everyone who went before, that his thought is the culmination of these earlier patterns of thought, like the classics or the medieval thinkers, for example, or the early moderns. Thought has progressed. So if you assume historicism is right, that we're conditioned by our moment in history, what I'm asking you to do is kind of impossible, actually. If we're framed by our historical circumstance, we think the way we do because of when we are in the society in which we find ourselves, there's really no way to cast about and try to think as another thought from an earlier age. That would be vain. That would be there would be no substance to that if historicism is true. So I'm saying that historicism is not true in part. And I think there's something particularly overreaching about what Hegel is setting about to do here in this passage. Let's get to it. Yeah, Gavin.
He's in favor of historicism, right?
He is a guy committed. He is the historicist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
I just want to say there's one passage shortly after that says,
Yeah.
therefore only the study of world history itself can show that it has proceeded rationally.
Yeah.
Like, is that perhaps the reason, is that perhaps one reason to justify why it's important?
What he's saying there is in part that you can't kind of pull yourself up like Baron von Munchausen by your bootstraps out of the sort of mud of human opinion, transcend history, and say this is what it was for, like Kant does. You need to move through history, find the contradictions that work within it, unfolding in an imminent direction, and then from the very privileged position of the end, say this was what history was for. Ultimately, it culminates in Hegel himself. And his consciousness of himself as a free being. And then the political project becomes, how do we make more of him? How do we spread that model of humanity the world over? So let's get into this. This is one of the most, it's astonishing. And I think, I talked about wonder earlier. I think it's really important when we're reading these texts that we are open to being astonished or even incredulous. Like, how could you say such a ridiculous thing? I think that's a very healthy first response often here.
That's all.
Yeah.
That's why I thought like that.
Kosher, yeah.
It feels a little absurd.
It can, yeah.
Like at times.
Yeah. So I mentioned Alexander Kojève before. He kind of had a famous set of seminars on the phenomenology of spirit, actually. In his introduction to the reading of Hegel, and he said after a while he would sort of take the show on the road and teach here, there, and everywhere, and said, and this is in Letters to Leo Strauss, that there was something deeply disconcerting about an audience, once he become a famous philosopher, an audience of students dutifully taking down notes and nodding as he went, when he said, I'm saying the most ridiculous things you could possibly imagine. We've arrived at the end of history. All human history has been moving in this direction, and anything that wasn't is really non-historical and kind of a blank page in history. And I claim to be perfectly wise. Like if the students, and that's what we're reading right here too. Keep in mind, these are his students' notes. So this is astonishing here. let's carry on to this. For even though one were not approaching world history with the thought and knowledge of reason, at least one ought to have the firm and invincible faith that there is reason in history, and to believe that the world of intelligence and self-conscious willing is not abandoned to mere chance, but must manifest itself in the light of a rational idea. We have an appetite for this. We want to know. What's the idea here? What binds our experiences together? What is this all for? That's part of what makes us human. Actually, however, I do not have to demand such belief in advance. So he says that it's probably likely the reason you're all here is because you want to know the reason why. That's a good starting point. But I don't need to demand that reason in advance. That would be a helpful sort of step in this direction to say, look, this is an indication that all of us, all human beings, are inclined in that direction to the extent that we want to know why. It is not, I don't even need to know that. I've got a firmer basis for the claims I'm about to make. And this is what it is. What I have said here provisionally, and shall have to say later on, must, even in our branch of science, be taken as a summary view of the whole. So we begin, and this is how he's a systemic thinker, or a systematic thinker, that he'll keep repeating the same point in more depth and detail again and again and again, but it's the same idea. It's the same dialectic. It's all about human freedom ultimately. It is not a presupposition of study. So I'm not presupposing history is moving in this direction. And I'm not presupposing that all of you want to know what the reason in history is. It is a result which happens to be known by myself because I already know the whole.
Wait, did he just say he knows what everyone wants?
He knows what all of human history is advancing towards. He can make sense of every previous moment in the history of human ideas in relation to himself at the end of history.
Hegel, I don't think Kant walking around Berlin swearing drunken things counts for rationality.
Oh, no, and it's not that all human beings do reasonable things all the time. Clearly, that's not the case. People do stupid things, irrational things, hateful things recurrently. And maybe they don't mean anything whatsoever. They're just these little blips. Or, and we'll get into this more, maybe they irrationally push back against this modern project, which has been so much of postmodernism, to say that, no, we're not motivated by reason. There are these differences that are important. There are this sort of heat within the machine, that this kind of chaos within that resists this program of the rationalization of human behaviors. But Hegel will say that even those irrational attempts to push back against progress further animate the progressive spirit. But not even getting there, just let's rest on this for the time being. Hegel claims to be wise. He claims to know the whole. He claims to be not doing philosophy, really. Philosophy is the love of wisdom, and you love wisdom to the extent that you know you don't have it. In the same way that you love another human being because they're not your simulacrum. They're not you. They're someone else. They're beyond you. Something essential to your being is beyond yourself. That's what love tells us. And Hegel here is saying, no, I don't love wisdom. I have wisdom. I happen to know the whole.
Is there a little bit of a woe is me for my grand burden kind of thing going on here?
Pardon me?
It just feels like almost like he's pretending that it's almost like a burden. Like, oh, I can't do philosophy anymore. I have wisdom. So.
Well, keep in mind, this is an epistemological... It's an epistemological claim. I think he's doing it early on in the lectures, so he's meaning to astonish the students in that class. Quite the claim to make, but it's an epistemological claim too.
Does Hegel call himself like in his personal life?
I don't know. He's full of himself right here. Let's focus on this right here.
We're just trying to understand the thinker.
And
As
so,
they understood themselves.
Yeah. Did Hegel know that he was a pompous asshole or not?
no, I wouldn't cast aspersions on him. This is interesting. If someone claims to be, have transcended philosophy, to be completely wise, to give an account of all world history, inclining in this singular direction, this is quite the claim to be making. Yeah.
Doesn't he say just before this that we don't really want to sit there and just know things like itemized history?
Yeah,
That's what he's kind of
Yeah, so he says, no one really cares about, again, this happened, that happened. And, if it was just chaos, why even study it? Just wait for the next thing that's going to happen. Why study history at all at that point? So no, he says, one way of getting at this is to assume that we all want to know the reason why, but I don't even need to assume that because I happen to know the whole. Okay? And so back to our first question, how do we judge those various historical moments, our values, our different conceptions of human nature? One danger, and we'll see this in Nietzsche, is relativism. But Hegel's answer is, if you live at the end of history, you have a privileged perspective in looking back on all that went before as anticipating that present. Mm-hmm.
Isn't this whole premise basically, we talked earlier about how like human values change with time, but isn't the whole point that we're at the end of time?
Yeah.
Like human values won't change forever. I know the
Yes.
whole, so I can judge based off of my own concept of what human values are or whatever, because I'm at the end of history.
Yeah, and so we've arrived at the end of history, in principle, mind you, because there are still these dark spots on the map. And now it's just a matter of extending the principles of the French Revolution worldwide. It's a matter of planetary.
It's not history then. It's too irrational to be history according to Hegel.
Well, that's why we need maybe some form of planetary imperialism, some form of a universal and homogeneous state, a kind of steady march to progress by which we match the success of European nations the world over.
Let's colonize everything again.
Colonization is a part of this too, certainly, absolutely, in all seriousness, yeah. This is the idea of progress that had informed Western imperialism in terms of its intrusions beyond Europe. This is the idea. This is the secular faith in progress that in so many ways animates that political movement. All right, let's leave it there. I hope you enjoy your Thanksgiving, and I'll have your proposals back with comments after the break. Yeah, enjoy. Let me turn things off here.